if you think the Bible is a coherent concept, and I don't, but if you think there's such a thing as the Bible, there's all these translations and different verses and different, books and canons and arrangements. And so I think the whole idea of the Bible is just a cultural construct. I don't think there is a book that's the Bible. Except you could pick up one in the store, and you can call that one the Bible. But these people, a lot of them disagree with each other. A lot of them contradict each other. But the New Testament is part of, for Christians, the Bible. And Christians think, well, Jesus was a kinder, gentler, and he changed everything, right? When Jesus came, he changed everything. And now the Old Testament is, that was the Old Testament, right? In Julia Sweeney's play, she says, the New Testament, it's called the New Testament. It has the word new in the title, so it's new, right? Well, it actually isn't. The New Testament is a little bit gentler. They were no longer fighting genocidal wars. But I think the New Testament was a huge missed opportunity. This would have been a great point in history for Jesus to come up and say, and really turn the whole thing into a moral tale, into something important. For him to step up and say, guess what, folks? I apologize for my dad. He was a jerk. Slave mongering and genocide, and that was bad. That was bad. He should not have been that way. Did he say that? He said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I and the Father are one. When the Jews asked him who he was, he said, before Abraham was, I am. And that word I am is where we get the word Yahweh. We get the great I am. And the Jews were so angry they took up stones to throw at him when he said that. They knew that he was claiming to be not just a prophet or a son. He was claiming to be identical with the God of the Old Testament. He was not a chip off the old block. He was the old block itself. That's, if you believe the New Testament, and I'm not saying you have to. And in fact, there are some people who think Jesus of the New Testament was not the Jesus of history. And so that's a different question. But at least if you take that New Testament story at face value, that character was claiming to be identical. He only quoted from the Old Testament scriptures. He only quoted his father with glowing approval. And whenever he quoted the Old Testament, he often took it out of context. He often pretended like stuff back then was talking about him. And when you read it and you go, that wasn't talking about him. Whoever wrote it was trying to make monkey with the facts. But for example, when he was asked what are the greatest commandments, and you know that one, he says, the first is that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, and then love your neighbor as yourself. That sounds kind of neat, doesn't it? Kind of lofty, kind of better than the Old Testament. Sounds, oh yeah, the New Testament is better and kinder. But if you look back at those passages, Jesus was quoting the Old Testament. And where the Old Testament said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, he was quoting that. That was part of that marriage vow, that covenant vow that God was giving to his people as they were about to enter the promised land, to commit genocide and steal and rob and ethnic cleansing and get all those people out of there. God was saying to them, when you go into those cities that you did not build and you harvest those crops that you did not plant, don't be tempted to go after their gods. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart. In other words, it was a very jealous, exclusive, controlling kind of love. It wasn't like, let's all just love each other and sing Kumbaya together. It was more, it was this jealous kind of a love. And then he goes through the curses. And if you don't, here's what's going to happen to you. So Jesus was quoting with approval these words of a genocidal deity who was telling his people, the Israelites, to go in and commit all this horrible bloodshed and violence. And when he said, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, that sounds kind of cool, doesn't it? Love thy neighbor as thyself. But he was quoting an Old Testament passage where you can very clearly see, he didn't quote the whole thing. It first started talking about when you and your Hebrew and your Israelite kin and neighbors get together, you should love your neighbors as yourself. In other words, love your own kind. It didn't mean love your neighboring tribes. We know that. It didn't mean love everybody else in the world. It just meant your own group, your in-group. You should love your own people. Well, every group does that. I mean, big deal. Every group does that, you know. Trump supporters love each other, right? Do they love their neighbors as themselves? And by the way, we're not a political group. There might be some Trump supporters here, so I'm not saying anything either way. And there might be, we're all different. We're all different. It doesn't follow that if you're an atheist, you're necessarily a liberal, but a lot of us tend to be. But So loving your neighbor as yourself was not really that big of a deal. It was just common tribalism, basically. Take care of your own is what it was basically saying. So, and then peace on earth. The word peace in the Bible, and especially in the Old Testament, the word peace did not mean what you and I think it means today. We think peace on earth, right? Let's all be tolerant and love each other and get along in spite of our differences. Isn't that kind of what we think? Let's not fight. But that's not what peace meant in the Old Testament. That's not what peace meant in Roman times. You know, the Pax Romana. It was peace on earth. How? Peace was an imperialistic, militaristic word. It meant pacification. And in the Old Testament, you'll see the word shalom. There's a passage where God says, when you go into the village to attack it, to take it over, offer it terms of peace, shalom, and if they do not submit to your terms of peace, then you shall either kill them all or turn them into slaves. Then you will have peace. The Romans had peace because all their neighbors were then declawed, basically, right? They had a military peace, and so there was now there was no threat of anybody, taking over their authority. So peace in the Bible was that same kind of a thing. It wasn't what we think. This, how you hear a lot of believers talk about peace. And even love, that word itself. One thing that surprised me when I was going through the Old Testament again was that you hear the words evil and wicked a lot. Those Canaanites. God had to exterminate them because they were evil. They were wicked. It was an abomination. You see that word a lot. Abomination, wicked, evil. Most of the time, I didn't count, but I bet it's 98% of the time. There are a couple of notable exceptions, but most of the time, evil and wicked have nothing to do with human moral behavior. People were called evil and wicked. Why? They worshiped different gods. They worshiped idols. They did not worship the jealous Lord. I call him the Lord Jealous in the book, because that's his name. He actually says in Exodus 34, the actual Ten Commandments, my name is jealous. If somebody asks you what is God's name, he says it right there, my name is jealous. So evil and wicked almost always had to do with not obeying and not worshiping and not bowing, like a jealous, controlling husband. If a woman is talking to another man that he doesn't like, you evil woman, right? It's that kind of a thing. And that's nothing evil or immoral about that. But in the Bible, the words evil and immoral and abomination had to do with obedience to his authority. So there are a couple of places like a disobedient son who's a drunkard is evil and therefore he should be stoned to death. You'll find some of those places. But so the Bible's not a moral guide. It's only moral if you think obedience to the dictator is what morality means. That's all it is.